Okay, we're live. Welcome to Dive into Worldbuilding. Today's topic is personal weapons, and Kat was talking about jumping straight to Wakanda, but I actually thought we might start with hat pins.
Oh, hat pins are awesome.
Hat pins are awesome, and in fact, there was a point at which women had these hat pins and their hats were super elaborate, and it was a great excuse to have a hat pin that was like 6 or 7 inches long. It's like a little tiny stiletto.
Didn't they have laws about how big your hat pin could be because of this?
Yes, that was a response to the demand for long hat pins. Yeah.
So now I was going to start off talking about personal weapons by saying that they come in two very broad categories: the obvious weapons and the concealed weapons. So I guess we're talking about the concealed weapons first.
Okay.
Which is kind of cool, and that gets into like repurposed things like hat pins.
Yeah.
But also, knitting needles are not given enough respect that way. Although perhaps it's just as well so that we can all knit on airplanes.
Yeah.
Well, to quote the inimitable Ani DeFranco, every tool is a weapon if you hold it right.
Well, I mean, all you have to do is watch spy movies, and you know that you can make anything into a weapon. It can all be a weapon.
Any tool can be a weapon, but not every weapon can be a tool.
True.
Have you tried slicing bread with a gun?
Slicing.
Yeah, well, they make clubs, but they're really, really fragile and really not very good for that.
Yeah,
once you turn a gun into a club, you pretty much decided you're not going to use it anymore.
But it will be in fragments. So, yeah.
Damage yourself. Because the kind of person who will use a gun as a hammer is not the kind of person who will make sure that it's cleared beforehand.
I'm sorry. I just now I have fish and bicycles in my head, and since we started off with femme stealth weapons, we should talk about corset knives.
Okay, talk about them.
Well, I know just that there are many places in traditional garments that were for knife concealment, and now that we have a taste for really revealing skin-hugging clothes, it's really more difficult to hide things. And there's also the infamous cases of the TSA seems to think that black women hide weapons or who knows what else in their hair. And I don't think there are any actual cases of women doing this in post-TSA
I've never
times.
heard of one.
And here's a weird thing about that whole thing. There's an episode of Stargate Atlantis where Ronan, Jason Momoa's character with like massive amounts of hair, just keeps pulling bladed weapons out of his hair. Nobody blinks. No one has ever checked this man and his amazing hair for weapons, even though they know he's basically, this is what he does. This is what he is. He's a weapon. He carries weapons. He uses weapons. That's what he's good for.
So wait, are we saying that it's Jason Momoa's fault that black women are getting? No, I don't think.
No, it's not.
No, I think it's not.
I just see that the.
I think we just violated causality.
It struck me as an oddity that in a place where you really ought to be security conscious, nobody has ever bothered this character, and yet women, it's just. It's an excuse to put their hands where they're not wanted.
Well, I mean, it was one of the factors. The whole idea of concealed weapons was one of the factors behind eliminating pockets from female clothing.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
Really?
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean,
here's the thing. So if women were more into buying automatic weapons and assault rifles, they would be banned instantly.
Well, this is all theoretical, but I mean, I hear that kind of thing a lot applied to marginalized populations of various types.
Yeah, but if white women, there are too many white women doing stupid things with guns.
Well, I mean, there are plenty of women doing stupid things with guns, but yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. All right. So back to hat pins and actual, because we shouldn't get into the gun discussion because obviously I'm going to rant.
Guns are a personal weapon. We all know this. We don't need to discuss it. Onward.
Guns are a personal weapon.
There we go. But blades and pointy things. I had totally forgotten about hat pins.
That was why I wanted to start with hat pins. So I missed.
So is a what was it, a sugar hammer that was infamously used as a tool of feminism to sugar? It was, I think, a sugar hammer. Am I wrong? There's a feminist legend about, like, a Western feminist legend about breaking windows using some kind of Victorian fancy kitchen tool.
Well, yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I know what a sugar hammer is. Possibly. I've never heard that legend. Although ice picks have a very long and storied history.
Yes.
Ice picks. Yes. I mean, if you're in the kitchen, there's like so many weapons. Right?
Well, and
I have heard it
since
said,
the
why are you
17th
pissing
century,
off the people who handle the knives?
Since the 17th or 18th century, and men don't wear heels anymore, they sort of de-weaponed themselves because those are amazing weapons.
Heels? Oh, yeah. Heels, yeah.
Well, the
spike
heels
in
that
particular.
men were wearing were not spike-heeled.
Yeah. Spike heels.
I mean, all of the clothing repurposed as weaponry is a classic thing. But
else,
actually, Juliet, can we scroll back to the beginning of the episode now and kind of talk about what we're using as parameters for what we're discussing?
Yes, I always like parameters.
when you came up with the discussion title "Personal Weapons," I kind of just thought we meant like hand weapons of various sorts, and now we're going into this very niche corner that I think we could spend the entire hour talking about. So if that's what we're going to do, I'm totally happy to do that.
The entire hour in a corner. Let's not. But no, I agree. Sometimes I like to start with parameters, and sometimes I like to start with examples and get into parameters.
Sure.
But parameters are always good. So, well, how do you want to frame this, Kat? Because there are several ways to do it. I mean, one of the things that occurred to me when I was first thinking about this topic was, what are the circumstances under which you need to carry a weapon?
All of them.
All of them.
So I think an interesting thing is to talk about preppers, and some other people talk about, I think, a daily carry. Is that what it is? Everyday carry. Where, what is in your pouch every day? What is in your wallet? What is in your handbag? And usually those things are utility tools and, aspirin and spare tampons in case you need to staunch a wound kind of stories. They often aren't what you carry as a repurposed defensive weapon. And it's interesting to me that some things are explicitly banned legally in most jurisdictions, and other things are considered normalized. For instance, if somebody did start wearing a hat pin, I think most of the hat pin rules are sort of in such neglect that I don't know that anybody would think to charge somebody with use of a hat pin, as opposed to a broader sort of assault. But I know people who sit there and they emphasize, anything can be a weapon. Your ballpoint pen is a weapon. And then I laugh and I'm like, I don't carry a ballpoint pen.
Yeah.
But I was once given a copy. I don't think I still own it. I was once given a copy of the amendments to the Constitution that was printed on a very thin sheet of steel, stainless, that was intended to be repurposable as an edged implement.
Wow.
It was very sharp and pointy and had a carrying case. and
Yeah.
it's just a plain piece of steel. It has the Constitution written on it, so it was designed as a propaganda tool against the TSA. I'm not sure how one would use that, and also because all four edges of this were sharp, I think it was one of those things like a obsidian knife where it's just as likely to cut you.
Yeah. Sounds like it.
But it does lead me to things like, I don't know anybody who's actually used that beer bottle on the bar technique, even though it shows up in every movie about a bar brawl.
Yeah, almost.
That's actually really, really dangerous because you usually end up not with a weapon, but with a handful of glass shards.
That was kind of my assumption. So,
yeah. Well, and it's also the jurisdiction thing is interesting because, California, I could not have a blade longer than my palm, and I don't have big hands.
Mm-hmm.
But I could go out every day with 45 strapped to my hips, as long as I didn't enter the city proper.
So what happens if you're a traveling chef?
You label everything and put them in the bottom of your carry-on. That's how you...
Oh, no. I don't mean flying. I mean just in general. You're saying a blade bigger than you're in California. Did I misunderstand?
Yes, like a personal weapon, which would be the subject of the show. It's I don't know. You'd have to ask the California police, but I'm pretty sure that they're not just generally pulling over anybody in restaurant black and whites to see if they can arrest them for having a chef's knife. But the idea of what you're allowed to carry is a really, really strange idea. The TSA is another thing. Like I have a titanium. It's sort of a crowbar. It's a tiny crowbar, pry bar. Mm-hmm. It also has a bottle opener and a nail puller and stuff on it. It's not sharp. There's no blade. So the TSA can't confiscate it. And oh dear God, they've tried. Wow. But there's that thing about it's small enough to be used as a screwdriver, and it only takes 4 pounds of pressure to cut skin. So if I really wanted to hurt somebody with it, I could.
But I was just talking to somebody who wasn't allowed to take a set of pots and pans aboard because they were told it could be used as a bludgeon.
Somebody's working really hard to exercise their power.
Yeah, as sexist as it might be, at that point I would be like, sack up, dude, stop it.
Want to see how good a bludgeon it can be?
I might give you, cast iron, but Teflon? No.
I'm just reading an account here that says that an English suffragette threw a hatchet at Prime Minister His Honourable Asquith during his visit to Dublin.
So axe throwing really was a thing before, 20 years ago.
Axe throwing feminist.
I wonder how good she was.
It doesn't say she murdered him. She just threw it at him. I think that implies that she only threw it toward him.
Well, that's depressing. I think everyone should practice.
Is glitter by this consideration a personal weapon then? People have been glitter bombing people.
Well, so I wanted to get back to the whole idea of what matches your circumstances.
Right.
Because circumstances is pretty vague, but we can, when in the realm of science fiction and fantasy, we can have all kinds of circumstances. We can be out in the woods with the bears and the moose. We can be, in a high-tech city of so there are lots of different options. Star Wars tends to have these strange weapons that basically pretend that the speed of light is the speed of a bullet. Right? Or actually even probably less than a speed of a bullet because you wouldn't be able to see a bullet. Right?
Well, I mean, basically Star Wars has, sounds in space and...
Yeah, well, right.
Yeah.
Who knows how lightsabers would actually work and
why they don't cut through the floor when you drop them, and
the circumstances. So the things that you'd be defending against, or if you're talking about defensive weapons, because there's right now you're defending against, say, physical attacks or weapon attacks, like humans or bears or wolves, or guns, knives. But
yeah, tasers though. I mean, tasers are a thing too.
Yeah, but I mean, what about? Because I was looking for things like skunks. Skunks have personal weapons.
Yes, they do. Yes, they do.
Yeah, that was the other question I was going to ask: is do we have, are we distinguishing between weapons that are separate from your body, or not? Because humans have teeth, can be used as weapons, but we don't have claws.
Do we actually define those as weapons, or as defensive or offensive?
Define them as weapons. I mean,
I think a weapon is a tool, isn't it?
Yeah, generally speaking. I mean, I suppose if you had really long acrylic fingernails. I don't know.
Oh yeah. Okay, so we won't talk about teeth or claws. But there's, pepper spray. Yep. And does anybody remember? It was one of the early Buffy episodes with the bat sounds and the giant praying mantis.
I am not enough of a Buffy fan to remember this. Sorry.
There was this giant praying mantis, and Buffy was told to record bats and play that, because it would disable the bug.
Interesting.
Somehow I don't remember what the reasoning was.
So you're kind of going into a sonic weapon?
Yeah.
You could have a sonic weapon.
Okay, sure.
Which leads to in world building, if you're talking about non-humans, what are the defenses that we would have against humans, or non-humans attacking humans, or as what defenses that would non-humans have against humans?
I feel like that's not about discussing weapons as much as that's discussing defensive mechanisms.
You could also turn it around, because that could be, because you could use, say, a sonic weapon as an attack. You could take it and use it on somebody who wasn't actually trying to attack you in order to.
Well, and another thing that we haven't even touched on is the cultural associations of particular weapons.
Right. I wanted to talk about, as long as we were talking about this, the which weapons are legislated against and which are allowed, and sort of the culture of. I think that one of the things that's happening right now, even though we weren't going to talk about that word, is that people want to get back to this culture of the gentleman with his sword.
Yeah.
Sort of assumptions about what that means culturally. But at the same time, that was within the context of a culture where it was perfectly ordinary for people to carry an eating knife with them.
Yeah. Right.
And we are no longer carrying eating knives, for instance, or any knives at all, are pretty much deprecated, but people want open carry for guns. So we currently, without going into sort of historical fantasy or history or far into the future, are having a cultural issue around who carries what weapons and what's considered a weapon and what's considered a tool, and what's considered displaying your rights and what's considered evidence of banditry or some other form of antisocial and dangerous behavior. And that all becomes
also what's considered a toy, because paintball guns hurt.
So we also have the issue of people wearing cosplay weapons and being killed as if they were capable of creating peril. We have people who are holding pencils and assumed to be holding guns or some other things. So that's all a fuzzy place. But I think sociologically, it's really interesting that there are periods in history where somebody's considered underdressed if they're not carrying whatever. In the same way that right now, I think that people would feel naked without their mobile phone. And somebody who doesn't have a portable online device is considered a bit handicapped, which wasn't the truth for any of us when we were younger. I mean, we all remember probably not much more than 10 years ago when being online all the time seemed like science fiction.
Yeah.
So I like the fact that Marguerite Reed in Archangel actually discusses the culture of weapons and about what it means to wield a weapon. She has a very pacifist culture within the community, but with a designated hunter who is also their defense specialist. And she has to have her gun always under this very controlled circumstance, except when she checks it out officially and takes custody of it in order to go out hunting to take biological specimens. And it's very much sort of expanding that idea we currently have about gun control and saying that your weapon and your ammo should be stored separately. And in some countries, you have to store your ammo at the shooting range, and really separating it from its utility as a instantaneous weapon or tool of destruction. But what's considered everyday carry, everyday wear? What is the equivalent of, do you have your ID on you?
Yeah.
And even, do you have your ID on you? There are cultures that consider that really offensive. I remember talking to English friends 30 years ago who thought that the fact that Americans always carried ID was just this preposterous thing that we were submitting to.
Yeah.
And their driver's licenses didn't have photographs on them, whereas we're in the regime of real ID, and it has biometric data in it, and it's RFID is very common, and all these scanning and things. So in that kind of cultural context, do we put chips in all the guns and know where every gun is at all times? Do we assume everybody has a gun and not worry about it? Do we do what we're trying to do and try to ban all the guns? What do we actually do?
Well, this is actually a kind of one of the central ideas behind Bloodchild by Octavia Butler, of if you have a sort of marginalized culture that you are using for a certain reason, do you allow them to have the tools that could possibly hurt you, and why? Because their big centipedes were using humans as reproductive, basically surrogates, and yet and they didn't allow guns, but because you also needed to be able to kill animals, you sort of needed one, and that's kind of the tension in the story.
Right.
And we, one of the things that we haven't touched on is, okay, we can talk about defensive or offensive weapons, but it's defensive against whom and offensive against whom.
Right.
Are we trying to defend ourselves against our own species, against large space hungry mastodons? I mean, there's all sorts of a huge range of things here.
So because I often frame a lot of the world building I do around decolonizing narratives, the issue of who was allowed weapons and who was not is often not about the reality. It's about the politics of the situation. Because the claim on the frontier is it's a weapon against bears.
Yeah.
Or bison or whatever else. But the reality is that it is a tool of making sure that the people that you have conquered don't recapture territory. So it's also interesting to note whether or not that the story you're telling is actually the real story or the fig leaf.
Sure.
And also, again, I'm going to go back to England for this. in a country where you've eradicated all of your large people menacing fauna, it becomes much easier to persuade the population to be willing to disarm than in some place like the US, where we actually are living amongst bears. And some people do want to be able to defend themselves against bears. I mean, I have a friend whose shotgun is only used for, has only thus far been used for scaring off the bear.
Right.
It was hard to dissuade by anything else. And I agree with that point that sometimes you need something that, if you're living in that kind of circumstance, but the other way to handle it is on in scale that's not about a personal weapon. So the world building question is, why is the weapon personal as opposed to communal?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah, and which persons are allowed to wield it.
What have you done with your environment that you need this kind of thing? And then, you have Ian Banks setting up a dueling culture, right?
Yeah.
We have fascinations with dueling cultures.
Yeah, but if you think about it, we also have Australia as an example where everything is designed to kill you and they don't have any guns.
No, it's not.
It's not, though.
No, it's not. As a Californian, I want to object to this. I think we have a preponderance of Californians on this current episode. But
it's a narrative that was really constructed by that one single show.
Well, also, it's a thing that English people from England believe, because England tends to be a very, very safe environment for humans on that level. But Australian fauna are not of the sort that need weapons to be kept at bay. They are venomous. They are...
I think that we are taking me a little bit too seriously here.
No. I want to talk about this because if you are a Californian, you actually live amongst coyotes, and the wolves are coming back. And if you go far enough into the mountainous regions, there are bears, and we have mountain lions.
Oh, and we have rattlesnakes.
Well, most things are not effective shields against rattlesnakes. I mean, you're better off with a shovel if you're going to try that approach.
That's true. My personal weapon is a shovel.
I say this because I lived on the edge of the chaparral in Los Angeles growing up. And so we actually did see coyotes and mountain lions, and we didn't have bears close by, but we definitely had rattlesnakes in the yard. And yes, my dad when I was a child, my dad's been gone for a long time, has decapitated rattlesnakes with a shovel. But, you're not going to use a sword or a gun on a rattlesnake.
Well, you'd hope not. And I don't know that it's necessarily, a Californian so much thing either. We don't have any poisonous snakes or venomous snakes, but we definitely do have bear and moose and, all of that sort of thing. But I don't see it as necessarily, I don't know, we as a culture, Minnesotans don't seem to have as much of a fear of it. Like, you don't actually have to have a gun to face down a cougar. That it's not necessary.
Yeah.
We have wolves. They are outside. It's good. We have bears. They're all over the place. So I think there's a good argument to be made actually about again, what's the story, and is the story the truth
right.
about why this is a thing?
But again, I want to circle back to where I want to emphasize that I'm expanding and not refuting this. Because of this Minnesotan example that we have, I think that it does reinforce the idea, though, that being in a place without large fauna to create peril makes it easier to promote a gun control narrative or a no personal weapons narrative than it does to be in a place where these things are around. And one of the things that I'm curious about is if there's a difference between the parts of Minnesota that are more wilderness as opposed to farmland. Because
it's, you are okay with carrying a gun, in near the Chaparral, but possibly downtown Compton, you'd want a different kind.
Right. This is what I'm saying is that
yeah.
well, even in the Chaparral, there's a very noted difference in weapons ownership between people based on their politics.
Yes.
And
well,
so
there's
people
also the conflation of what they're for versus what they actually do. Like the people who go, well, I actually hunt with an AK-47, and I'm like, you're an idiot, and you have probably broken a tooth on that stuff. Because if you've ever tried to clean a deer, you don't want to shoot it with 87 bullets because you got to pull every single one of them out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, so the again, the story is really important, and seeing through the story. Actually, one of the things that we should think about as far as world building goes is that technique of saying, okay, this is the story that our people tell each other, but there's an actual story running underneath it that we're not going to talk about explicitly. Because there's a whole bunch of other things that have to go into that, as far as, you know, what is considered violence? Is violence considered sexy? Like, what are all the implications of this, rather than just on its face, do we have it or do we not? How does it fit into our culture?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, so explorations of whether or not you have outsourced personal and community safety, or whether it's considered a, you know, every single citizen responsibility, or how that's managed is a giant question. Again, why are the weapons personal?
Well, and also to whom? We don't allow certain people to carry weapons, even though we say it for everybody.
Right.
We have outsourced our community needs for safety, and yet we still have people saying, well, but I need it for mine. And we also have this horrible narrative of, you know, I will support the troops until it's time for me to want to shoot them, which is just really, really weird. And I would love to see somebody represent sort of that conundrum against a science fictional setting, because I think it becomes either ludicrous or scary, or both, really, really quickly.
Can you expand on that? Because I think I understand what you just said in the last bit, but I don't want to be misinterpreting.
Well, okay, the narrative that we have about a lot of our weapons ownership, and especially out in those rural areas, is not as it's yes, it's about hunting, some of it, but some of it is about I need to be able to resist the government. And yet this is the same group of people who say, well, we must support our troops. Well, sure, you're going to support them until it's time for you to shoot them? This makes no sense. And it also
what do you mean by until it's time for you to shoot them?
No, they're coming to take your weapons away, or they're
But my understanding is that on base, soldiers don't carry their weapons.
They do not.
No,
except for the MPs. So there's a weird thing about that too. Because, you know, there's also a narrative of, well, all the bad things happen in gun-free zones. Well, almost all of the bases are too. So, again, what are we saying and what do we mean?
So
I think those are in conflict.
That narrative of all these things happen in gun-free places is,
it's
as
a
long
BS
as we're
narrative.
Going to go there, it is a complete BS narrative.
It is. Absolutely.
It is.
Gabby Giffords was shot in an open carry state. Ronald Reagan was shot with Secret Service surrounding him.
Tamir Rice was shot holding a toy gun in an open carry state.
Yeah. Tamir Rice was shot because he was in an open carry state playing with a toy gun. John Crawford was inside a store examining a thing on sale. So these are completely false narratives, and Unless we're
we
really
use
discussing this in a world building sense.
This is where I'm going, is that can we use that understanding of that false narrative to create that in our own worlds? Because we're going to need them, I think.
So to parallel it in a secondary world with a weapons related similar cultural phenomenon, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that sort of taboo versus social good moment, and also just the idea of being able to construct a double triple narrative at once about something, so the characters can talk in this one way about what this object is or what this piece of society does, when it actually operates in a completely different way that they may or may not understand, and may operate for different people at different times, in very different ways. When you have a toddler with a firearm is a totally different deal than when you have an adult, hopefully. Mm-hmm. But we don't talk about that.
Yeah.
So I think it's, you know, there are a lot of people right now who are, you know, whining about, well, no one writes science fiction I want to read anymore. Well, I think we're kind of done with I personally am done with the sort of shoot 'em up, really straightforward piece of fiction. And one of the nice things I'm seeing coming out of some of the newer science fiction is that we're getting more into these dual narratives, triple narratives of let's layer one way of knowing on top of another and then see how they interact, rather than just having to create conflict between individual people.
So wait, there's a piece of this iconic science fiction that gets taught to middle school and high school students, because we make everybody read, well, we don't make everybody, but a lot of students have the opportunity to read 1984 and Brave New World, which are essentially precisely that. This is the government propaganda, and this is the effect on the people living under that system. And I know that there's a lot of, at the time, clandestine Soviet bloc work that was addressing this issue. So I think this stuff has been talked about the difference between the claimed and the actual. And if you look at non-genre work, and I don't know about genre work, but it's actually a major thing that sociologists and anthropologists look at when they talk about Japanese cultures, because honne and tatemae are things that are discussed constantly about the thing that is said and the thing that exists behind that. And so I think it's interesting to explore the American conundrum of gun control as a secondary world issue.
But
I don't know that when we're discussing personal weapons, whether that's the, I guess it is sort of the question we want to ask, but I would rather not spend, maybe I just need to let the people who want to spend this time discussing the lies of gun control or anti.
Oh, no, I mean, I think that it's worth noting that 1984 and Brave New World and those kinds of doublespeak dystopias are out there. But I think it's also valuable to try to reflect the kinds of narratives and propaganda that we have in our current world. So there's always room for that.
Yeah, because if we weren't talking about weapons, I would be referencing Jingo, which does the exact same thing, just not about weapons at all. Oh, no. I don't know. I suppose if you want to call culture a weapon, it does. And you can.
Well, that's a whole other episode, and you and I could definitely spend an entire week discussing how culture and doublespeak is a weapon, and overt claims on one side and versus actual impact on the other.
Well, we often use the word weaponized to talk about language and various kinds of things. So maybe we should put that down as a topic for some other time.
It's interesting too. I mean, because we talked a little bit about how people would feel naked in certain settings without one, and I'm reminded over and over again of Lois McMaster Bujold and the guys with the two swords, which they were required to wear them, but if they actually took them out and fought with them, they got a death sentence, even if they won. Because they were meant to be only ceremonial. But there's a point at which she also says, okay, yes, they're ceremonial, but all the women were given was a knife the size of your finger, so they were never going to prevail against the two-sword men.
There's also an interesting story within that world about an accident. I don't remember if the death was accidental, but it was not actually the two swords. It was two knives or something that technically became two swords for purposes of being defended.
It was two swords off of a decorative piece of basically a wall hanging.
Which story was this?
It was the son of one of Aral Vorkosigan's political supporters engaged in a drunken brawl.
Play fight.
And yeah, it started off and then it got more and more serious and then somebody died. And the father of the duelist comes back and pleads with Aral for his son's life, and he says, "No, I can't." And it was about the death of dueling culture. I think it's actually in Barayar.
Yeah, it's the one right before. It's when Miles is hurt in utero, because it's the brother of the guy who did it.
Right.
So that is in Barayar.
I have not read that in years.
And as a result of that execution, a whole bunch of other stuff gets put into play. And in fact, it does lead directly to Miles. Sorry for everybody who didn't want Vorkosigan spoilers, but those books have been out for a long time.
They really have. They have.
Yeah, no, this happened. It's cool.
I need to find out if they're downstairs or if they're still in a box in the garage.
I clearly need to reread that volume because I used to be able to recite that story from memory. And now I only have the vague details.
She had so many really good things to say about what is violence, because she talks about the violence, the quiet violence of men in green-walled rooms who send everyone else to die, but then are safe in themselves. So
well, she also talks very much about what it means to be sort of the line between the science explorer and the conqueror, because they're not so very different, even though each of them believes they are very different.
And even the tools they use are pretty similar.
And that she is very aware that she can repurpose her expeditionary force tools to be weapons. And that you get to see over the course of her narrative that she's very, very good at evaluating her surroundings and weaponizing them. And in fact, that's how she escapes from a situation very early in the story where she is imperiled in a pacifistic world, but she manages to use very calculated violence to escape. And it's shocking in that context because the culture has become very, very pacifistic.
Well, it's interesting. The female of the pair uses policy to create weapons in a certain, if you'll give me that. And then Errol uses weapons to create policy.
Yes. It's an interesting discussion about how politics works. Yes.
Cordelia?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
So going back to personal weapons, one of the things, this is usually not my role. This is really strange.
That's cool.
I am usually the queen of digressions. So going back to personal weapons, the thing that we have that's interesting in genre fiction is we have, essentially we've taken the current gun versus sword or gun versus knife dichotomy, and we spread it even further because we have things that are very remote distance weapons, blasters and things like that. And then you have very close range weapons. And there are also the difference between weapons that can be used with a low level of skill and a low level of physical ability versus weapons that require a high level of personal ability. We have
that's a good point.
Star Trek phasers on one side versus lightsabers on the other. But the popular hero in there, everybody wants to be a Jedi, but we have Han Solo with his blaster, which I find really fascinating when we have it echoed in Indiana Jones and his gun. One of the things we haven't talked about is the issue of disparity in tech levels and what that does for what you're able to do, and being aware of that context of what happens when you have a more technologically advanced weapon versus a lower tech weapon. And the temptation is to say that the higher tech weapon always wins, but if you have energy weapons that need recharge, if you have things that run out of bullets, if you have delicate mechanisms that jam, there's always the famous story about how they had to sort of de-engineer American infantry weapons to be more sturdy as opposed to more, I don't know what you want to call it, because
more sand resistant, probably.
Yeah, definitely.
More sand and mud resistant. And also, I would love to redo this talk with somebody with more, I know some people who like to do discussion of weapons in contemporary and science fiction context, but the repurposing of other materials as personal weapons, protective and enhancement tools. I have a friend who made a fortune selling soldiers various little devices for carrying their guns more comfortably. And also there's the infamous stories about putting the condom over the muzzle to keep it from getting incapacitated isn't probably the right word, but making them inoperable in muddy environments. And so there's a danger in secondary worlds of making them either too grimy or not grimy enough.
Yeah.
Can I just interject?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. The discrepancy in tech levels of weapons, but there's also a discrepancy, or can be a discrepancy in skill levels. And there's this.
Right.
There's, I think, an assumption that the higher tech a weapon is, the less skill is required to hit your target, for example. But I'm not sure that's true. And at what point does someone who's very skilled with a lower tech weapon have the same chance of winning a duel as someone with less skill and a higher tech weapon of the same class? That is guns, firearms, or blades. Blades are pretty much, unless you're talking about, what metal they're made out of, blades are pretty much blades.
Well, I mean, there are loads of things that we haven't gone into, like all you can make out of meteorite and this, that, and the other. I mean,
well, I want to go back to sonic weapons and other things that are much more Stefano that we haven't talked about, sort of. Oh, yes, can we finally get to Black Panther?
Yeah, let's do Black Panther since it's 501. But
yes.
No, I think more. I'm not revealing a spoiler when I talk about a device which takes in kinetic energy and then eventually, after reaching its capacity, it's basically a capacitor, and then it throws back the kinetic energy. And this is a kind of personal defense and weaponry that comic books explore a lot, but a lot of other realms of genre fiction don't look at as much. And so I think it's interesting to talk about what else can be weaponized as tech and tools.
Yeah.
Well, there's always the sonic screwdriver.
Yeah, I thought of that earlier.
There we go.
Sonic screwdriver versus the sonic blaster. It's pointed out that the sonic blaster just can't do anything but be a blaster. Screwdrivers.
Well, and I mean, the other thing that we haven't really touched on is if you're world building, why would you pick a particular type of weapon for a particular type of society? Right? I mean, just because it's science fiction, does it mean that we have to have energy weapons? You know?
Yeah.
This is how you end up with Firefly, right?
What?
That's exactly what I was thinking. Is that's your Firefly solution right there. Which is basically, I mean, literally a Western in space.
Yeah.
Yep. All right. Well, we are out of time, but this has been very interesting, and we could clearly revisit this in a more finely targeted manner, one might say, since we're on the topic of weapons. But yeah. So thank you all for being here.
Chewy.
Do we want to talk about posture next time?
Posture.
Ooh, yes.
Yeah.
Let's do posture. That'll be fun. And excellent. Well, I appreciate you all being here. We covered some interesting things. Obviously, any topic that we take on is usually a massive one, and so we can only do so much in an hour. But I appreciate all your contributions. Kat and Kate, you guys were like being the Hercules today. So
yeah.
Anyway, many thanks, and I'll stop the broadcast.